Energy Transition Now with David Linden.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, David Linden, the head of energy transition for the Westwood Global Energy Group. And you're listening to Energy Transition Now, the offshore wind mini-series. Now, if you follow the offshore wind sector in any way, you'll be very familiar with the scale of ambition. New capacity targets seem to be announced almost every week, if not every month, around the world. And these really help to drive the industry forward. The challenge, though, is in delivering on those ambitions and those targets. While previous guests on this podcast have spoken on the question of deliverability in sort of newer and emerging markets specifically, what about the original sort of birthplace of the industry? What about Europe? I'm really lucky to have Justine Burg, the Vice President of Business Development in Renewables for Europe, from Equinor, here with us today to dive into this fundamental question. Justine, it's great to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Hello.
Hello. It is a busy time for Equinor, for offshore wind, and lots of things going on in renewables. So thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Let's maybe just start off with some of the basics. Not everyone knows what's going on, specifically with Equinor and also with offshore wind. So how about we start with the opening kind of question around how does offshore wind fit into Equinor's strategy?
Yes, thanks. A good intro, right? And maybe I should start with who are we, a bit some words about Equinor.
Please.
We have 50 years, or we've celebrated our 15 years anniversary last year. And we've been through really interesting journeys, starting from a Norwegian oil and gas company and transforming really to a true global broad energy company. And that is really translated into ambitions level when it comes to renewables, where we want to be a net zero company by 2050. And translating this ambition by investing 50% of our capex and spendings into renewables and low carbon business areas. So that's really significant. And in terms of volumes, we want to have 12 to 16 gigawatts of renewable installed capacity by 2030. And just to give a flavor, around 2/3 would be expected within the offshore wind. And you mentioned Europe, right? So really Europe here is a key growth area for a company like ours. Over the last year, very specific context, but we've been a proud, important supplier of energy to Europe, especially glass supplier. And within renewables, we have an attractive portfolio from early business development, but also to assets in operation. And we're aiming to grow. And just to give, for example, UK, which is one of our key centers for offshore wind development, we will power nearly 7 million UK homes from our offshore wind farms by 2030. And currently we have this Dogger Bank wind farm, which is the world's largest wind farm under construction with our partner SSE. So yeah, definitely offshore wind Europe, really part of the solution for our company and solution to the energy transition. And I think it's a technology where it fits very well with our oil and gas experience of offshore complex project, rough water, directly applicable to the offshore wind industry. And also with a specificity with regard to our floating offshore wind experience, which we like a lot, where Equinor has installed the first floating turbine, the first floating park, and now is finalizing the construction of the largest floating wind farm, Hywind Tampen in Norway.
Yeah, due to come on this year.
Exactly. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So there's a real history there of offshore wind, I guess, and then an ambition to do offshore wind globally, whether it's in floating or in fixed, essentially.
Absolutely. Yeah. So and we see that Europe is really key here. I think that what we see today is Europe really needs this affordable and secure, reliable electricity. And power prices have been such last year and such volatility that it has put so much pressure on government in providing this energy. And that's really what offshore wind can provide. So it will be a key solution for this decarbonization. And that has led to, as you introduced, some really, really high targets that we've seen, and we should discuss those probably a bit more. But also, these offshore wind electricity is part of this greater value chain, right? It's just not the electrons part, which is important for decarbonizing Europe, the grid, but also it's part of molecules, producing green molecules from that green electricity. So it's really part of a full decarbonization value chain. And you see that it's attract all European economies, whether through its direct generation of those offshore wind farms, or it's through interconnectors, transmission lines, or even through investments, like even for countries which do not have a coastline, like Luxembourg, for example.
Okay, so fascinating. No, I also look at it, I guess, Europe in particular as well. If you're trying to decarbonize, you need to work out what resources you have at on your doorstep to be able to do that. And I guess Europe is kind of blessed in some respects to have shallower waters, but also deeper waters if you go further out, but lots of shallower waters and windy conditions. And so being able to take advantage of that resource and do something with that to be able to reach your decarbonization targets, I think is important. And then I completely agree with you. The kind of decarbonization value chain that's there that can be built is an extremely strong proposition. I mean, just so people understand who maybe don't spend as much time in this space, when you say green molecules, are we talking about things like hydrogen, or sort of the kind of the power to X concept, which is developing maybe e-fuels, SAF, and sustainable aviation fuel, etc. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. I think that's the green hydrogen is probably the most known one, but there is all the types of other products, right? Green ammonia. I think power to X is another terminology exactly that encompasses all the potential and outcomes from transforming electrons into another product. But it could also be direct heating, for example, or the full system integrations component.
Okay, and then sorry, just a sort of question on that point: is that a core part of how you look at offshore wind in Europe, or is that really a secondary part of it? So really it's about the electron first and then the green molecule second, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that's definitely it needs to be seen as a full value chain, and I think that it is really about this full component. I think more and more of this will be also imposed for developer to still be relevant. And you see that also in auction, and we can come back about what form of auctions we see. But so system integration, power to X will be more and more entering into the mature markets, like in Denmark, in Netherlands, and in Germany. So it's really enabling this flexible demand altogether, right? Adapting the demand versus the production, which is intermittent, which will be also quite concentrated in some areas with the demand. So I think this is the key true to decarbonization. So it needs to be seen as a whole, really.
Okay, no, that's very powerful, I guess, once you've got that. Okay, we can come back to that. That's fabulous. So if we just come back to Europe, maybe specifically, that was quite grand opening around sort of big ambitions and big statements. What do we see in Europe in terms of kind of the key targets in the region then?
And there was a major event a few weeks ago, really, at Ostende in Belgium, right? We had a major offshore wind forum which gathered the head of states of 9 countries around the North Sea. It was Norway, the UK, Germany, France, Denmark, Netherlands. I think it was Luxembourg Islands as well, and Belgium. And there, so really, very big event. We're setting a clear ambition on making the North Sea this key powerhouse for Europe through offshore wind. And that the target then, those countries sets a target for offshore wind of 120 gigawatts by 2030, and by 2050, 300 gigawatts for the North Sea. And I think that really gives a sense of scale, right?
Yeah.
That will be developed over decades, where we think that today, around the same area, we have a combined capacity less than 30 gigawatts. So we need to multiply it 10-fold, right? So this means scaling up significantly, but that also represents, I would say, a fantastic opportunity really for European supply industry, for developers, and for the society. but this is definitely very ambitious targets. Equinor is very happy to see this type of targets. I think this is exactly what the entire industry needs, and then it gives something to work for, definitely.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's great to see governments coming together, because essentially it's going to require cooperation to make this work as well, and we'll come to some of that. But I mean, is it just those countries you've just listed there that are driving this, or is there a broader set that are also kind of integral to this scale, where there might be even more targets to consider? But certainly we've got that core group you've talked about. But what about sort of the wider picture?
Definitely. Actually, I think there is a mix of existing and emerging markets as well.
Okay.
The North Sea is quite a matured environment, right, for offshore wind.
Yeah.
The Baltic is also very interesting. Equinor has a development project in Poland.
Okay.
And I would say there is all a set of more emerging offshore wind markets in the south of Europe, which will be driven mostly by floating offshore wind, simply because of the characteristics of the water depths in those areas, which are more suitable for floating offshore wind. But many of those countries, like France, like Portugal, Spain, and others, have also set ambitions when it comes to offshore wind development, mostly driven by floating offshore wind. So I would say it's mix of existing and emerging markets, and to meet big targets.
Yeah, just so maybe someone like myself understands, or someone like yourself is looking at the market day in, day out. Would you say, somewhere like Italy also has become a bit of a surprise package as such, in terms of a market that's suddenly come about that people weren't maybe spending enough time on in the past, and suddenly, wow, look at this market, it's open tender and everyone's rushing for it in some respects? Or
I think that there are quite some few markets which I think see the potential of very attractive cost line, good wind conditions, and for a developer like a company like ours, it's very important to see ambition level translated into clear pipeline of tenders, or clear access pathway to access to lease to develop. So I think what is really at scale is translating these big ambition figures into concrete tender access, pipeline, visibility of access to lease, or and that's why we the entire also industry needs. I think we've seen Portugal now emerging with targets a bit quicker than what Spain would have said at the beginning. So it might be there is still some dynamics around these more emerging countries, and realizing ambitions into clear pipeline is what is really needed. That's the clear access route for projects.
yes, I mean, we've had some delays, I guess, as well, right? So it's not all been obvious. Next year we'll have another tender. That's the one that's just got bigger and bigger. In fact, some things like Portugal, I believe, have been delayed, and it's not obvious. But okay, we can come to talk about why some of that might be in just a minute. But so I guess the context here really is, certainly, let's say in Northern Europe, it's a tenfold increase. That governments are trying to set themselves from the current targets, and you've got a whole series of kind of emerging markets beyond that. Call it a Poland on one side and a Portugal on the other, in terms of opportunity set. So there is, in theory, no shortage of opportunity and ambition in this market. But I guess what I wanted to talk to you about specifically, Justine, is then, okay, so if you've got all of this, you've got all these opportunities coming up, what is it that you're seeing that's actually going to maybe be the difficulty in delivering this? Because it's great to see, but it's, in grand scheme of things, still a pretty nascent market. So what are some of the challenges you see, I guess?
Indeed, as you say, I think the ambition level is there, right? But there are a bit of stumbling blocks that could happen or derail a bit that plan along the way, unless it's really addressed. I would put probably these into three different buckets. I think one would be around project development technicals. One is about the macro context and that we see, and thirdly would be about the auction design that can have the stimulus for meeting this ambition levels. So if I start with the first one about the project development part, I think that today we see that in some jurisdictions it takes 8 to 10 years to develop. And that's not from a technical perspective. We're able to really develop that from a much quicker way and half or third of that time. But what takes a lot of time is that permitting and consenting. So really need to have a speedy, reliable permitting process. And how can we do that? I think, simplifying the system, maybe a one-stop shop, single point of contact, framework that limit the number of appeals, etc. So some simplifications around that part.
Yeah.
And then about second point, which is an important enabler, is the grid connections. That really would ensure that all those electrons that will be produced will be able to float across the markets and avoid the congestions and the cannibalization that can happen in some very dense areas. And in order to do that, we really need to have a build out of the grid, both onshore and offshore, that enables that. Sort of a network of the offshore wind farms with the demand, and that is really.
That's a connection and essentially a build out of the grid capacity itself.
Exactly.
Onshore, fine, okay.
Onshore and offshore, so a hybrid project that we've also putting up this interconnector, but also the up components onshore that really brings the electrons to the customers.
Okay.
So I think that's really permitting, consenting, and the grid connections really, really important. And then beyond that, there will be innovations and technology developments which will improve, but I don't see that as really, really clear bottlenecks. But there will be more digitization to optimize the O&M. There will be lots of data collections, etc. So that's a bit on the development side, I would say.
And so just for my understanding then, so if you are obviously, you go to any conference, let's just say these are two classic discussion points. Do you see movement in governments making efforts to change this? And you said about their simplification, that's what you can do. But on the project development side, do you see a realistic effort being made to change permitting, consenting? People really do want to change grid connections and infrastructure capacity. There's a lot of different markets to talk about, but just in your sense, when you're looking at the market, trying to make it work, what's your view there in terms of how the markets are trying to, or governments maybe are trying to address that?
Yeah, I think that there are some movements, but there is probably some even more collaboration. There are some really good projects of energy islands coming up as well, putting multi-purpose interconnectors across countries. I think that will show how, European countries are going to collaborate, really. And I think that gives lots of opportunity, but still early days, right? We need to have that reflection to co-create and co-shape the design of those systems between the regulator, between the developers, and key questions: who will own the cable? How are we going to use those interconnectors? On what terms? Will it give access to the power generation or just the infrastructures? So all these sets of key questions, which are in the making, and the will to develop those is there. So I think it's really going in the right direction, but it still needs lots of co-work and collaborations around this, and it's a new system thinking, I would say. On the permitting side, yes, there is, I think, a political will to translate into simplified permitting system. But we need to still see that in actions. So lots of probably good ambitions, but needs to be translated into clear laws.
Okay. And then what about the macro context then? Your second major point. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, and I think that if we had this discussion a year ago, probably had been very different, right?
Yeah.
Because the macro context, I think, is important to spend a bit of time on and reflect on, because what we see globally is definitely increased cost of capital. That's one part. General inflation, that's another one. That's it comes from increase of raw materials, and of course we've been facing extraordinary times over the last year of COVID and Ukraine war. So and of course, this push of greater offshore wind delivery. So that's all of that really translates into also significant increase of cost and supply chain squeeze. And this increase in supplier chain cost is really beyond the general inflations. So it's, there are some bottlenecks. And that's really the macro context. And how is it important? Why is that important? Is because I think it's somewhat challenges a bit the typical model that offshore wind has been operating on. Okay. This has been a bit the norm in the business models in this industry, where then there was a situation where there were signed offtake contracts that was followed by reduction of costs. And why reduction of cost? Because there was technology optimizations and falling interest rate, and that resulted in good project returns, really, which was also boosted by farm downs. And now, because of the macro really changing, I think it could make a bit of a reset or a risk of slipping, right? So it could mean, will the model continue to operate? Will it need some rethink? Will the recent cost increase resulted in project being challenged or not? So I think it really changed a bit the traditional way that we've seen offshore wind operating and developing a bit over time.
And do you think that macro context is causing people to pause and go, is this, are these the right projects for us? Is this the right region for us? I mean, I know it's a global theme as well, but do you think this is causing people to stop and think? Like you tell your child if they're being naughty, but the same thing for the industry. Are they having to stop and think if, like, hang on a minute, does this industry still make sense under these conditions? Is that what you're kind of suggesting?
Well, I think it needs to. How this will affect in general projects, a bit difficult to really say, but I think it's a time to pause and reflect. Yes, definitely. Some companies might need to borrow more or not, use more balance sheet, assessing the portfolio, the project by project. Will it be delays, renegotiating terms? Yeah, I think that will trigger lots of discussion. How will this affect as well competition in tenders? I think that's also quite uncertain, but it gives a time to pause and reflect, and whether it's a reset or change of more business models. Could be. I'm not saying, but it triggers some key reflection. On the other hand, right, as we've discussed as the intro, is that the targets have never been that higher, right? So there needs to be that match between this deliverability and also this ambition levels.
Absolutely, and certainly. So we've Westwood as a business has done work around the kind of the cost side of things to try and help people understand where in the value chain, who's impacted, what, how, where, and what, and it's interesting. The kind of cost of capital bit is fascinating, because of course it hits some businesses much harder than others, because some of them can afford it or certainly choose alternative methods of pushing projects ahead, and others, let's say something like, say, in the floating wind industry, where there's a lot of smaller players quite reliant on external capital. Either it's drying up or their cost of capital has gone up so much that an already expensive technology has become really expensive for them. And without sort of extrapolating too far, the question that comes to mind is, does that lead to consolidation in the industry, right? And does it lead to companies that are actually more able to weather this environment, to survive and thrive, and others may sort of wither away? You don't have to answer that, because I'm not sure if you want to, but it's just an interesting discussion I've been having with some folks in the industry.
I don't have a specific answer. I think that will make this tension between companies, developers, and competitors in general, the context. Will we see consolidations or not? Time will tell. I don't know.
Time will tell. No, but it's interesting. Creative destruction. It's what happens, I guess, in all industries, but it'll be interesting to see where this goes. Okay, so You had 1, project development, 2, macro context, 3 was auction design.
Yep. Hmm.
What's on your mind around auction design and how it's either aiding or abetting what's
Yeah.
going on here?
I think it's good that we take a bit of a look at the auction design, and we've talked of the framework in terms of permitting, but auction design is really key, because this is how all those projects are put forward to developers, right? One of the points of addressing this macro is, and the inflation that we see in the macro, is to take that into account into how auctions are set. We need auction design that cater for this increase of prices, because then it needs to work for the developer, the supply chain, and therefore the country, of seeing those volumes being realized. And that's really important, that, to ensure terms with inflation indexation. Else that could really put risks on projects and may see a negative investment appetite. So that's one point, and we see that in some countries, this inflation indexations, which is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Another point is really about, and we've seen an increase in a trend, or at least an increase of ambitions for some governments about really local supply chain, local development, local jobs, and at the same time low prices. And here, seeing that a bit across all around the world, there needs to be a sort of a balance. So driven governments have been seeing some needs to build local industry and creating jobs, but also it might have impact on increasing costs for the projects. And that also reduced the ability to really standardize these the supply chain and the development. So I think we need to strike a good balance between this local content ambitions and the auction price, and I think avoiding in designs any strict measure requiring really specific local content, which will have a quickly increase of cost. So it needs to be balanced, because the European industry should remain competitive as well.
Yeah, and I guess it's evolving even further if you think about things like, so there's non-price factors being considered, obviously. So that's some of the things you're talking about there on the localization side of things. But there are other factors being requested of developers to justify their bids or to enhance their bids, I guess is the word. But they all come at a, while they're called non-price factors, they come at a price, a cost as such. But also all the other factors that are going on. So you think about carbon border adjustment mechanisms, the push to get more sustainable more generally in the industry, and all those elements. They continue to add layer upon layer of layer. What I perceive when I look at the industry from a kind of access and build perspective, it becomes more complex, way more complex than when the industry first started. I mean, is that what you're seeing as well when you're sort of assessing a bid and you're going, right, or not assessing a bid, or considering whether to bid or putting a bid together? Are you seeing that level of complexity just increasing more and more, and sort of essentially the uncertainty envelope increasing for you a bit as well? Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, I think, but we also like complexity, so we Equinor handles complexity well, I think. But indeed, you're right. There is a trend for more and more non-price criteria, such as ecology, environmental benefits, integrated systems, and probably the Netherlands is one of the country it is the most advanced, putting it to the next level, really.
Yeah.
But it also enables that those projects have a greater individual impact beyond, the electrons, right? So I think there is some benefit in doing that, but indeed it adds complexity. So I think it helps developing the growth of these additional technologies, and that's positive. But it's also, as you say, it has an impact in layers of cost. So it's finding again this balance, because that impact business case, that impact the prices as well. So I think positive to see some non-price criteria, but needs to be also balanced.
And what about, you mentioned auction design, but what about incentive schemes more generally, right? So I sit here in the UK, and right now we're going to have the next CFD auction going on, and there's a discussion around having non-price factors in that. Now, of course, what you've got in the UK is auction, bit of time, CFD, then FID, etc. Pick an acronym, but essentially you've got a disconnect already between the two, and so there's an element of risk in there, and then you're adding non-price factors potentially into play at a later stage of development in a project. So you're not even bidding as such on that until a later stage. I mean, you might not be able to sort of react specifically to that example, but I wanted to just give that example as to how incentive mechanisms are also now changing and evolving to sort of support this market. How are you seeing that? Are incentive schemes going in the right direction for you?
Well, I think you give the example of the UK. What I find it quite exciting and challenging at the same time is that there is not one single system across each country has its own systems. So that makes it, we need to look at case by case. We need to look at evaluate each market independently and the framework independently. But indeed, there are many different constellations. In terms of incentive or support, I think that's important that the EU and the national government consider targeted support on some items, right? Either on the infrastructure or on the industry, which will be needed to again reach this volume ambition. There are different ways of doing that. There are different ways. Also, it affects the scope of the developer. Does it include the grid connection or not? Is the grid connection covered by the authorities, for example? Is it CFD, two-way CFD? So there are different ways of support. And going back to the supply chain component, clearly, it will be key to see how this Europe Green Deal industrial plan will really, as a response to the American Inflation Reduction Act, will trigger some efforts, because indeed, I think there needs to be opportunity to on ad hoc levels to support that industry. That's one way of getting this incentive as well, and making this project being developed. Indeed. Port grid updates as well will be also critical pieces of this puzzle to make it happen. So if there is some investment needed, and how to get there. So there are different shape of forms of these incentives.
Yeah, okay. So I can see there's quite a few different ways of helping the industry evolve and develop, and providing certainty for the benefit of financing and revenue certainty, etc., but also other parts of the ecosystem that can help the industry grow. I mean, it's interesting to hear this. I'm thinking, if I go back 2, 3, 4 years, maybe we were talking very much around a subsidy-free opportunity world, where costs were forever reducing, and you were getting to a place where you don't need subsidies anymore, you don't need support anymore. This industry is free on its own. And even the subsidy-free bids that you see now, as you're kind of suggesting, aren't essentially 100% subsidy-free, because they're getting other forms of support to make that happen. But in essence, I mean, if I was to simplify, are we now beyond subsidy-free, as in it's not good to talk about subsidy-free as an industry now? That just isn't realistic in the current macro environment, in the current setup that we've got. The industry's moved beyond that we're actually in a place where the industry needs a bit of help, it needs a bit of support, and it needs a bit of clarity as to how to move forward. And just talking about subsidy-free opportunities is not the way forward. And maybe it never was, but it's about taking a different approach.
But we'll see more and more market going merchant, for sure, right? Many of these matured continental north part of the continental Europe are all there today. But again, there is the scope which is at the charge of the developer is such that some part of the scope is taken by the state. So it's
Right.
But yes, exposure to merchant, having the developers finding offtakes for the electron is definitely, with regard to the bottom fixed offshore wind, certainly the trend that we will see going forward. Floating offshore wind, however, is probably still depending on the scale and the speed of development. We'll need to rely still on some supports.
Okay, so if I take a quick step back, and you've answered a lot of this already as we've gone through, which has been fabulous. So thank you, Justine. But around sort of, if I listen to your sort of three key areas, around the difficulties or the challenges, so we say, but obviously they present opportunities in their own way, around project development, the macro context, auction design, and sort of other parts around that, around incentives, let's just say. That's quite a package of things that present a challenge to the industry, to governments even, right, in terms of how to make this industry move forward. So how, is what we've got appropriate right now as a market design or a setup? I mean, I'm hearing a bit of no, things need to change, but please, can you elaborate or contradict me, whichever way you wish to, on this one? But then maybe as an extension of that, because I'm sort of preempting your response a little bit, what in a sort of a nutshell needs to change? What needs to evolve to deliver, essentially, right? That's the question we're trying to answer here around deliverability.
But I will probably have to restate that maybe offshore wind is among the cheapest energy sources today, right? That's
fair point. Yes.
Yeah, and so more offshore wind will be good for the pocket of the consumers, and that's so it's a cheap energy sources. So, but as you said, I think system thinking will be required a bit to deliver on those ambitions and collaboration. I think, speeding up the development, maybe some ad hoc support, targeted support, having auction design that enables the developer, the supply chain, and the countries to all reap some benefits from development of offshore wind is key, and send some targeted support on infrastructure when needed, with maybe the opportunity set of building some really interesting interconnected markets, where here again, going back to my point, collaboration will be key.
Well, still quite a few different areas for the industry to sort out. And I'm for one excited to see how the industry is going to do all of that. And there's a lot of ambition, and part of the reality, I guess, Europe, is the politicians need to realize is it's a global market now, and there are global opportunities out there. I agree with you. It is a fantastic resource on the doorstep, with provides cheap electricity to reach capacity, but also climate targets. It's a wonderful thing. But if people struggle to invest, and you're seeing this in other places, you're seeing this in the US, you're seeing this in different parts of Asia, right? If you struggle to invest, then people will turn their attention elsewhere. Do you think there's a risk of that happening in Europe? Ambition's one thing, deliverability is another, and that results in people looking elsewhere?
I don't think so. I think the appetite is there. I think there are some hurdles that we've discussed, but they are manageable. So I think that the focus will be for all the different actors, right? Will be in making it a success story. So I think we have lots of ingredients to make it happen. I think there is, but of course, the points that we've discussed should be addressed. But there is, I think, ambition level is there, readiness of developers is there, supply chain is, has line of sight of some volumes. So I think there is all the ingredients to make it realized as well. So no, I don't think that the focus will shift away.
No, I agree. It's good to end it on a positive note there then. Justine, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us again. Very much appreciate your thoughts. I think it's great to see the ambition, opportunity, And I think the debate for deliverability, I think, will keep going because there's a lot to debate. But thank you for sharing your thoughts on that with us.
Thank you very much, David.
No problems at all. And thanks everyone for listening as well. Hope you enjoyed it. Please make sure you subscribe and give us a great rating. Talk to you next time.